minds think alike. This is the animal print luncheon. Okay? It's funny because when I told my husband that I was going to wear animal print, he was like, you know, that signifies. Oh, well, the president of PBS wears it, so right back. It's great to be here. It's really wonderful. I mean, it still feels kind of like a dream, you know, because I still feel like that little kid, the little girl in Chicago. And I'm going to tell you, because I know that this is a lot about the personal story and how we do what we do. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about what really is concerning and what really matters me as a journalist. So what Ivan Roman said, I was watching, I was like, you know what? As journalists, we have a responsibility. And that's why I'm going to share some stories of what I'm seeing on the front line, which of course, many of you already know. But to talk about myself for just a little bit. And it's funny because I called my mom and dad, who they got the life. They live half the year in Chicago and half the year in Mexico. So they really have a fabulous life. But I was telling them that I was coming down here, and I was telling them the first story I was going to tell was about crossing the border for the very first time. Because my dad is a medical doctor. He's a research doctor in otolaryngology. And he was in Mexico. I was the kind of surprise fourth kid. And my dad had been promised a job at a hospital that was being built by the Mexican government. It was going to be a research hospital. But as we all know, hubo cambio de sexenio, which means that there was a change of government, and the hospital never got built. And my father essentially was a man who needed a job. The University of Chicago knew about my father, and so asked him to please come and work at the University of Chicago. And my dad left 6 months earlier, and then my mom got on an airplane from Mexico City to Dallas, because there were no direct flights at the time. And just the thought of my mother getting on an airplane with 4 kids under the age of 7 and not speaking perfect English, already she has got serious props from me. But anyway, I had some kind of a rash. I was about 1.5 years old, and this is like early 1960s, and I had some kind of a rash on my body. And so when we got to the immigration point right there in the airport in Dallas, a very large immigration official said to my mother, well, you know what, everybody else can go, but this little baby's got to go into quarantine. And my mother was like, I don't understand. Say that again? And he said, no one, you know, you all are fine, but the little baby's got to go into quarantine. And my mother, who's also 5 feet flat, somehow at that moment found the strength to own her voice as a mother, a new immigrant to this country, and said to him, well, that's not going to happen. My daughter is not staying here. She is coming with me, and we're all crossing into, you know, we're taking our flight to Chicago together. And the official pushed back and said, no, you don't understand, it's a quarantine. And my mother was like, well, you don't understand who my husband is. My husband is Dr. Raul Hinojosa at the University of Chicago, and we're going to have to call the president of the University of Chicago, blah, 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 blah. And somehow I was let in. But I love that story because it teaches me, which is the essence of my work, one of the essences of my work, which is what I try to tell young people, which is to own your own voice and learn to own the power of your own voice. Then I was in Chicago, being raised on the south side of Chicago as a Mexican immigrant. And I also attribute my understanding of what American democracy is, again, to my mother. It wasn't like my mom was reading all the books about what a democracy looks like, but it was Chicago on the South Side in the 1960s. And there was an organic understanding that the civil rights movement, which was involving predominantly our African-American neighbors, my mother understood profoundly that this was part of who she was as a new American. So when I was in 3rd grade, my mom wrote a letter to my teacher and for all of my brothers and sisters saying, you know, my kids will not be in school today because we are going to see Martin Luther King speak. And there were other mothers in the classroom in the school that had done the same thing, but it was somewhat controversial. But when I remember that moment of being in a rally on the street, in Chicago, seeing Martin Luther King, what it spoke to me about was what democracy looks like, the essence of what democracy looks like, something that my mother and father, growing up in Mexico, where you never voted because there was no democratic participation, and the PRI had been in power for years. So my mother understood that this was what the essence of being a citizen was, even though at that time the only person who was a citizen was my father. I don't know how many of you know this, probably none of you, because none of you know me that well, but I did move to New York to become an actress and a dancer. So something happened. Actually, it's a fascinating story about why, and I haven't told this story to my daughter, who dreams of being a flamenco dancer and an actress, and I hope that that happens for her. But something happened when I went to my very first professional audition. I was about 18, 19 years old. And I mean, this was, you know, there was not a lot of Latino theater going on. This really was like, you know, it was groundbreaking stuff. But I did this audition for a movie, and I did a great audition. But the director kind of looked at me and he was like, great audition, but he's like, you know, I don't know, you're not tall enough, you're not short enough, you're not white enough, you're not dark enough, you're not street enough, you're not sophisticated enough, you're not Latina enough, you're not American enough. He's like, I just don't get you. And something in me kind of died at that moment. I gave him the power to take away the dream of me actually realizing becoming an actress. Although, you know, Broadway is still there. You know, and, you know, it could happen. You never know. I moved to New York in 1979 from Chicago, which was you know, it was a relatively Mexican city. I mean, we would go into the Barrio Mexicano every weekend. I was crossing borders my whole life, whether it was from Hyde Park, the community where I was being raised, to El Barrio Mexicano, to leaving Chicago and going to Mexico every year by car from Chicago, all 6 of us in a station wagon. It's true. Which is why, because I had been crossing from the north to the south, I knew immediately that things in this country were going to change profoundly when I saw Mexicanos in the American South. It was a huge, huge moment for this country, and a big change, and something that, of course, has set off many, many repercussions. But anyway, I get to New York, and there were not many Mexicanos in 1979, right, Angela? You remember, there were like 3. And I was one of them. You know, I had to like pack up my tortillas in boxes from Chicago and freeze them for 6 months. I would bring my salsa verdes, you know, and freeze and take that and also stock it on the shelf. But something else happened that I'm sure that when I say it might sound controversial, but at the same time for me it was very liberating, because while I grew up having a lot of issues around identity, and I absolutely went through a self-hatred moment, absolutely. Just never fitting in, never feeling quite American enough or quite Latina enough. But when I got to New York, I had come already to a point of really loving who I was as a young Mexican immigrant growing up in Chicago. Then I got to New York and I was kind of like, there are no Mexicans here, so what am I gonna do, you know, like, viva la raza, you know, like. And it was a teaching moment, because what it taught me was the ability to also let go of our nationalism. Because while nationalism can be something profoundly empowering, it can also separate us. So for me, the experience in New York was that I became a pan-Latin Americanist. My Puerto Rican friends, Angelo Falcon, I just keep on looking at him because he's right there, you know, who's been an activist in New York City politics. Bob Garcia, the congressman. I mean, I understood that I was no longer just from Mexico, I was part of a continent. I became friends with people from Colombia, from Argentina, from Cuba, from Chile. And it was an incredible, liberating experience to not be just tied to just one country, but to understand that I was part of a universe. And then living in a city like New York, I believe that I did become a citizen of the world. Now, I end up getting involved in radio through WKCR, the Columbia University radio station. And, you know, it just goes to show, because you never know, the young man who was my colleague back then, when I was first working in radio, is now about to be named the president of WGBH, the public television radio station out of Boston. Who knew? Por eso mi papá me dijo, don't ever burn your bridges. Todo bien. I never really thought that I could be a journalist. I mean, even though I went to Barnard College, studied Latin American studies, political economy, and women's studies, there was no one out there like me except for Geraldo, who was doing really good work back then. He was, Geraldo. But there was no one out there like me. There was certainly no one like me in public television or radio. So it was at the urging of someone from Barnard that said, you should apply for that internship at NPR. You're involved in radio, but I was still like, yeah, but I don't really think I can do it. I think oftentimes when you're young, and this is why I love to speak to young people, is to not close the doors on yourself. And especially at a moment in history right now, when so many young Latinos are looking at images of hate and division, yeah, I'm not surprised that these kids are turning to suicide. It's a huge story that we should be looking at. But anyway, I go and apply for an internship at NPR, and I get hired. And then I am working at NPR, the first Latina here at the NPR headquarters. I understood immediately, while I love producing for Scott Simon, I wanted to be on air. I wanted to tell my own stories. So I embarked on a project, basically, to make this happen. I moved to San Diego, then moved to Tijuana, and actually worked in San Diego, so I was crossing the border every single day. I was working at KPBS. And eventually made my way back to New York, and eventually got hired by NPR. And in my first couple of years as a reporter, I was doing a lot of stuff that was really, it was groundbreaking. I mean, I was doing youth reporting. I was spending a lot of time in the Bronx. Everywhere I've been, they always name me the Bronx bureau chief because I care deeply about the Bronx because it's been so maligned. So I was out in the Bronx. I was doing stories with young people and crime and violence. And I had done a story about some very bad heroin. I'm sure you remember this, Congressman. It was called Goodfellows and Tango and Cash. It was very potent heroin. And people were dying, and this is an important part of the story, because people were dying in all areas around New York City, not just the Bronx. People were dying in Westchester and in the suburbs in Long Island and New Jersey and Connecticut because, while reporting this story, I understood that the South Bronx had been chosen as a market point for the sale of drugs because you can get in and out easily. So why is it that this happens to our communities? Anyway, the point is that I did these stories about the South Bronx, and I ended up here at NPR visiting a few days later, and an NPR personality who shall remain nameless came up to me and she said, "Oh my God, Maria, those stories that you did about the South Bronx, they were so moving. But I have to ask you a question. Weren't you terrified to be in those neighborhoods?" And I said, no, I've lived in those neighborhoods in the past. The interesting situation was that she probably never would have thought to ask me if I was terrified the first day that I stepped foot into National Public Radio headquarters in Washington. That I was terrified. And so I tell this story because I always like to remember that we don't all see the world through the same perspective. And it doesn't mean that one perspective is right and the other one is wrong, but that is the essence of what America is a diversity of perspectives and experiences. And that's why we in the media have such a huge task of making our newsrooms diverse, because we represent everyone in this country. So the way one incorporates this into one's life is that I, with my children, for example, I use teaching moments every single day that I can. Well, one of the teaching moments is the fact that my kids I married, because I became a pan-Latin Americanist, I married a man from the Dominican Republic. And, I also talk, I feel like one of the things I do, and I hope people respect it, is that I kind of talk about some of our issues internally. Racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism. I believe that we as Latinos, we must be self-critical on these issues. And so here I go, taking my mulatto fiancé, we hadn't announced quite yet, but to a wedding in Mexico. And you know, all my family is like, Herman is mulatto with a ponytail and an earring. He's an artist, vegetarian, you know, etcétera, etcétera. And my family was like, pero ¿cómo va a ser, María de Lourdes? ¿Te vas a casar con un hombre de la República Dominicana? They don't even speak Spanish there, right? It's like, no, you know, but even within my own family, of course, once I told my family that Herman had grown up with Juan Luis Guerra and had designed his latest album cover. ¡Ay, olvídate! Ay, Juan Luis, ay, we love you, Herman. Funny, I should be telling this story because Juan Luis is getting the Grammy Award achievement tonight. And Herman, in fact, was really an old friend of Juan Luis's. But Herman and I are raising two children in Harlem. My relationship with the African American community is one that I feel very, very strongly about. And I believe it is a responsibility of all of us here to step up to the plate, because apart from the issue of immigration, which of course is huge, the issue of African American Latino relations, I believe, is central to what's going to happen in the future in this country. But thank you, yes. Thank you. So, you know, I told you that I kind of had moments of self-hatred. Well, I was María de Lourdes Hinojosa Ojeda, and I really wanted to be, when I was growing up, Randy Kalish, Susie Goldfarb, Lisa Tim, but no, I was María de Lourdes Hinojosa Ojeda. Blah. I hated my name. Now, of course, I love it, even though I get hate mail. You should know. People write, and they're like, why do you say your name like that? Can you Americanize it? I mean, it is something that you need to know that I probably have. This is probably one of the high points of hate mail that I receive, and I think it is, as Ivan was saying, it's a moment, it's part of the times that we're living in. But what do we do with our kids? Well, you take a tradition that maybe you dislike, maybe you had a problem with, maybe you wanted to be far from, and as you get older, you're like, no, you know, I love this. And so my son is Raúl Ariel Jesús de Todos los Santos Pérez Hinojosa, and my daughter is María Jurema Guadalupe de los Indios Pérez Hinojosa. You're going to be tested on that before you leave. But with my kids, you know, it's real life. So that when the paisano knocks on the door to deliver the Chinese food, it's like, ¿Qué pasó, paisano? Pásale. ¿De dónde eres? Where are you from, paisano? Come in. And you know, usually the paisano is like, wow, somebody's recognizing me? Somebody's talking to me? Yeah, I do that. Or I'll see a woman who stands on 72nd and Columbus with beautiful earrings that I know are from Oaxaca, and I'll be with my kids, and I'll start talking to her. I'll say, Señora, ¿y usted de dónde es? No, pues de Oaxaca, señor. Oh, really? And how many languages do you speak? Oh, I speak Spanish, Zapotec, Mixtec, Nahuatl. And I will say to my kids, look at this. Here is somebody who is speaking languages that are hundreds upon hundreds of years old, existed before English existed, and she's standing right here. And I say to my kids, your responsibility to remain bilingual is because you do have a responsibility to help those who are quadrilingual in other languages but who do not speak English. So learning Spanish is something you should feel proud of, but you also know that it's something that you can use to help the less fortunate than you. Okay, now let me just take a few minutes to talk about my feelings of where we stand in America today. And I just, you know, when I was writing my speech, I was like, you know, I just could spend all this time talking about myself, but I can't, because I believe so strongly that the moment that we are living in right now in history is crucial. I mean, I have felt an urgency to tell stories in the past, but there is an urgency that I feel now that is like a fire that is moving me forward. I want to tell you one thing that happened a year and a half ago when I was in Indiana covering a story about how immigration was playing out in the midterm elections. Now, you're thinking immigration, big story, midterm elections, she must have gone to someplace in the Southwest, maybe someplace in the South. Indiana. Hotbed of immigration, Indiana. No, I know, it's not. There's a 4% Latino population in the state of Indiana. But immigration was the issue that Republicans and Democrats were running on. Democrats, even more stridently than Republicans. And we go into one area of Indianapolis called Little Mexico, and we had been warned how dangerous it was. No pasaba nada. Really, the crime rate was non-existent. We discovered in our investigation. And we did an interview with a woman there, a madrina, who kind of helps new immigrants who came as undocumented, 35 years ago to Chicago, and she and her sister both became citizens. And her sister is Republican, and she's a Democrat. Fascinating. But as we were leaving, she ran out to show me something, a piece of paper that she had forgotten to tell me about, that had all the store owners in Little Mexico had woken up one day, and this was plastered in their windows. It was a leaflet written by hand with magic marker, and it said, "Wanted, armed American citizens to hunt down illegal aliens that the government won't catch." In Indianapolis. That's horrific. And the fact that we report about nooses, which is horrific too, but we don't seem to take these threats seriously, is a problem. Because I do believe that what is operating right now is a culture of fear, and it is the fear of the other. In fact, if Samuel Huntington had his way, I am the most feared person here because I maintained contact with my Mexican roots, because I'm Mexican first, because Samuel Huntington from Harvard, yes, it was an outward, I believe, attack against Mexicanos. But I'm Mexican, I stayed in contact with my roots, I'm bilingual, I travel back and forth, I remain culturally aware of my own experience, and all of this, according to Samuel Huntington, is going to destroy America. Destroy it. And yet, when I asked Samuel Huntington, when I interviewed him, and I said to him, this was when I was at CNN, and I said, "Professor Huntington, so do you have a lot of Latino immigrant friends? Do you hang out with a lot of them? Do you speak with them?" Because he had just written a whole book about Latino immigrants. So I wanted to know, how is he getting his information? He was like, "Well, no, not really. I don't hang out with a lot of Latinos." I was like, "Oh, okay." I said, because in all of my years covering immigration, not once has an immigrant said to me, "Learn English? Jamás. Who wants to learn English? I hate English. I want everybody to speak Spanish." I've never heard anyone say that to me. I've heard people say, "I want to learn English, pero qué difícil. How hard is it to learn a new language when you're working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and then on Sunday it's the only day that you have to recuperate? It's hard." And then I said to him, I have also never heard any immigrant say, "Oh yeah, I crossed that border to reconquer my land." Because laude and etc. It's all about the reconquista, the invasion and the reconquista. And I was like, really? Because, I've been on the border, I've interviewed hundreds of immigrants, and not one has ever told me, "Oh yeah, it was for the reconquista." I do not understand how we can have a country where the other is so feared. I do not understand a country, and it is our responsibility, and it is the media's responsibility. You're exactly right, Ivan. We challenged at CNN. There was a market decision made to promote laude. There was a clear market decision made to go for ratings and numbers. And what gets sacrificed in the meanwhile? When I think about what's happening now, this is not just an anti-illegal alien movement. This is an anti-immigrant movement, and it is an anti-Latino movement that we must confront head-on. Because at the same time that that the media makes these decisions to go for the divisive. Does anybody know what the largest children's character in the history of television is? Anybody know what it is? Thank you. Dora the Explorer. $10 billion. Probably, that was yesterday, so it's probably $11 billion in Dora the Explorer. A bilingual Latina character. Qué miedo, right? A lot to be afraid of from Dora the Explorer. What is the hottest, I'm sorry, I love it, the hottest new television show out there? Ugly Betty. Not Kane. But Kane is fascinating too. Kane is fascinating. I'm watching Kane. It's a little too Dallas for me, but that's okay, because what they're doing with language with Kane is fascinating. I think Ugly Betty opened the door and they're walking through it. Fascinating. I mean, I don't know how many of you saw the episode where they had the two Cubano actors talking, oh, que volado, chico, que pasó a hacer. Of course, ningún Mexicano understood what they were saying because they were speaking Cuban Spanish, which I think is even cooler because they're like really going for it. I swear. The kids, Ugly Betty's great with the kids. It's just that, you know, like the sex change operation, having that conversation with my daughter at 9, a little difficult. Pero bueno, little difficult. I make fun, but I cannot separate from the fact that we are living in an America where people are fearful of a knock on the door without a warrant, where they can come and arrest you and deport you within 24 hours, and you are leaving behind American-born children. This is not just anti-immigrant, anti-Latino. This is against basic civil rights and human rights, a situation that has been created at this moment. And at the same time, when I was interviewing Paul Cuadros, a journalist who's living in Siler City, North Carolina, he was like, you know, everybody talks about the invasion. There were labor recruiters from the South going into Mexico to find cheap labor. It was not a massive surprise invasion. There was a coordination. And you're exactly right, Paula. I was the first reporter to get inside the Smithfield Foods Corporation, the largest pork processing plant in the world, where many undocumented Latinos work, and where they kill 30,000 hogs a day. That's 1 every 8 seconds. And they want those workers there because they are cheap. We cannot, I cannot as a journalist, sit with my hands folded and not be telling these stories. And that is the urgency that I feel. I want to know what the presidential candidates who espouse family values, what they have to say about separating families, separating children, American-born children, from their parents. And I plan on asking them. When I interviewed Hillary Clinton after she had done the Spanish language debate, I asked her, I said, as a lawyer, do you believe there is such a thing as an illegal human being? And I said, and if you don't, then will you be prepared to not use that term in your campaign? She kind of fuddled around the answer, but then of course it came up during the debate. I'm going to leave you with 2 thoughts. I stopped using the term illegal immigrant or illegal alien, not because I met some radical Latino professor. It was from somebody who looked entirely different than me and who had the most different experience than me. Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize winner. And he said, there is no such thing as an illegal human being. You may have committed a crime, but he said, once you label them illegal, he said, that's exactly how the Holocaust started. And the fact is that we cannot forget the history of this country. And yes, there were Americans who were deported, American citizens deported. I'm going to leave you with this final story that I tell almost at every speech because it is uplifting. After September 11th, which was the most difficult story for me to ever report and changed me as a mom and as a journalist, I knew immediately, within hours, I knew that there were undocumented immigrants who had been victimized on September 11th. And so within 2 days, I had the story on about Julia Hernandez, whose husband, Antonio Melendez, had died. He worked at Windows on the World. And we did a story in the Bronx 2 days after 9/11, and everybody was crying, a very rare thing for a CNN crew to have the cameraman, the sound man, myself, my producer, the whole family, all of us crying. And we put this story on the air, and we got response. Julia was sent letters and cards. And it was very uplifting to know that, yes, the rest of the country identified with us as New Yorkers. A couple of months later, in December of 2001, the phone rings in my office, and on the other end of the line, there's a man who says, hello, is this Maria Hinojosa? And I said, Hinojosa, yes. Hi, Miss Hinojosa. My name is A.J. Dinkins, and I'm a hairdresser originally from Augusta, from South Carolina, but I live now in Augusta, Maine. I live here. I'm a hairdresser, and my partner, Rudy, the farmer, well, we have just raised several $1,000s for the Julia Hernandez family in our church. And I want to come and deliver this money and these gifts to Miss Hernandez, but Miss Maria, he said, I have never been to New York, and I have never been to the Bronx. Would you please meet me at the airport and take me to see Julia Hernandez? And I said, A.J. Dinkins, I'll be there, but I'm coming with a camera crew because I'm going to do this story. And we did the story of A.J., who had, gay hairdresser that he is, had dyed his hair red for Christmas. And we go off to the Bronx, and you know, A.J. had never met any Mexicans, and Julia had never met a white gay man that she didn't work for. And there we were in the Bronx, my beloved Bronx, and it was a love fest. You know, I mean, who would have thought that these people who had nothing in common would find this love? And they did, and it was just beautiful. And as AJ was leaving, he said, oh my gosh, I want to invite the whole Hernandez family to come to my farm in Augusta. And I said, well, that's, you know, a wonderful thing, and we'll see if it happens. Well, 6 months later, the phone rings, and it's AJ. Hi, Maria, can you bring your husband and kids up to Augusta, Maine? Because I just invited Julia Hernandez, the 4 kids plus a cousin, to come up and spend a week at my farm in Augusta. And I said, AJ, I'm not bringing my husband and my kids, but I'll be there with a camera because I'm going to tell your story. Now, I had never been to Maine in the summer, but I know why the bushes like it. It's beautiful, stunning. Back in 2002, it was still pretty homogeneous white. I think that's changed in the past few years. But I don't know if you can imagine, like, here we were, this motley crew. Julia, 4 Mexican kids and the cousin. AJ, who had dyed his hair blonde. Rudy, the 6'4" farmer in his overalls. Myself, my cameraman, who was a hippie with a ponytail, and my African-American sound tech. Okay, a motley crew. And everybody is looking at us in Augusta, Maine, and they're like, who are these people? And why are they so happy? Because all we were there to do was to help these Mexican-American kids, all 4 of them citizens, to forget about the fact that their father had been killed a year ago. And when I get into my moments of sadness, it happens often. My husband says, you know, there are people who want to tell these stories, but you will always tell these stories of sadness. And it may be true, but it moves me, because I do want to find the humanity in all of them. So I have this picture, and you can come and look at it later. It's actually me, AJ, and Julia Hernandez, you know, with a beautiful, pristine lake in Maine behind us. And what this symbolizes to me is that people who are prepared to get outside of their comfort zones, to extend a hand to the other, the one who is so feared. This is what this means to me. People who are prepared to cross borders within their own country, within their own homeland, within their own communities. Julia crossing the border to take her family to a gay couple's house for a week. And AJ prepared to open his house up to a family of strangers, essentially. And us to tell the story. So we do have a responsibility to not be silent anymore, and to work on these issues, and to, as Ivan said, not be afraid to push back. This is a decisive moment in history, and all of us here, not just those of us who are in the media, all of us, you are all leaders, and you must, I believe, all engage in this dialogue. Thank you so much for honoring me. I appreciate it. Thank you.